This is the Municipal Land Use Board meeting for the Borough of River Edge for Wednesday, March 9th, 2022. It is about 7:33 p.m. You stand and... Mr. Gibbons, would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Nice to be able to do that again. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome back. It's nice to have everybody live and not in the Hollywood Squares version.
Hollywood Square.
Oh, my goodness. Finally, would you call the roll, please?
All right. And do we have the statement of open public?
Do we still need to read them?
Not the Zoom one, but just that it was properly noticed.
Oh, yeah. Let's see. Thank you.
If you have the one from Zoom, then it has the right date.
Okay. All right. This meeting of the Municipal Land Use Board of the Borough of River Edge is being held, in compliance with the provisions of the Open Public Meetings Act and associated regulations. Notice of this meeting was published in the Bergen Record on January 8, 2022, posted on the front doors of Borough Hall and posted on the borough's website. The notice included the dial-in and login information that's for participation, but we're okay. We're meeting live.
That's all.
Copy of, and that's it?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I'll do the roll.
So
I'll update that.
I thought it might be the first chair to actually be virtual for the entire tenure. Yeah.
All right, Mr. Mayor.
Here.
Mr. Caslin?
Here.
Ms. Boland? Here. Mr. Merman is absent tonight.
He's excused.
Mr. Pfeffer is also absent at the moment. Mr. Cray?
Here.
Mr. Kellyan is absent, excused.
Excused, yes.
Councilman Keenigo?
Here.
Mr. Gibbons?
Here.
Mr. Grasso is absent, excused tonight. And Mr. Esposito.
Here. Okay.
Also present is Mr. Behrens, the planner, and myself, Marina Steinley, the attorney.
All right. Ms. Steinley, first item on our agenda this evening is review and approval of minutes from our February 9th, 2022 meeting. Questions or comments? Minutes as circulated. Okay. We have a quorum to vote on this evening?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. No comments? I'll entertain a motion to approve these minutes, please.
So moved.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbons. I have a second. Mr. Esposito, thank you.
All right, and we can do a voice vote, but Mr. Mayor, Mr. Kellyan, Councilman Keenigo, and Mr. Grasso were not present at that meeting.
Okay. All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstained?
Abstain.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Keenigo,
Okay. And Mr. Pfeffer has read.
and, sorry, you, Mr. Pfeffer. Okay, the next item on this evening's agenda is review and approval of minutes from our February 23rd, 2022 meeting. Okay. Comments, questions from the board on the minutes circulated? Okay. I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes, please. So moved. Okay, I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbons.
All right, we can do a voice vote, but Mr. Mayor, Mr. Caslin, and Mr. Grasso were absent at that meeting.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed, any abstained?
Abstain.
Abstained?
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Our next item this evening on the agenda is a discussion of ordinance 22-2, amending the code of the Borough of River Edge, authorizing and encouraging electric vehicle supply and service equipment and make-ready parking spaces. So a copy of the ordinance was circulated for tonight's meeting. Do you have a statement?
So this ordinance is, in effect, adopts a model ordinance that was issued by the state regarding electric vehicles and electric vehicle service equipment. The ordinance proposed, which is number 22-2, is almost identical to the model ordinance proposed by the state, but there are some irregularities that Tom and I discussed earlier. There is a resolution proposed that I prepared that just summarizes what the contents of the ordinance, but it doesn't include it verbatim. But the ordinance itself, I would recommend that the ordinance should include 2 additional sections from the model ordinance, which are F6, B, and C. And those discuss fees for electric vehicles. Also, in the proposed ordinance 22-2, there's a typo in F4. It labels the subsections as A, B, C, D, H, I, J. I just think it should be E, F, G, and that matches the model ordinance. And my final comment is that the ordinance should reference what section of the zoning code that it will be incorporated into, whether it's going to be its own subsection of the zoning code, or if it's going to be incorporated as a new chapter of the borough code. So those would be my only comments that we could add into the proposed resolution. Otherwise, I believe that the ordinance is not inconsistent with the master code because previous master code revisions have discussed electric vehicle supply and providing a means for people to install electric vehicle supply equipment.
Okay. Mr. Barnes?
I think that was a nice summary. I'll give a little bit of the history and how this came to be and why many municipalities in New Jersey are addressing this issue. I'll try to be brief. So in July of last year, Governor Murphy signed a bill basically intended to promote the installation of electric vehicle charging infrastructure throughout the state. And that bill amended the municipal land use law. And as Marina had stated, there was a model ordinance created, which became effective immediately and became the de facto law for any municipality who did or did not have an ordinance. Some towns that already had EV requirements, the state ordinance now superseded those laws. So currently River Edge is under that model ordinance. And the new one, I guess that's been proposed, takes certain excerpts from that. And so I'll get into that in a little bit. But again, just to note a little bit about this municipal land use law amendment. On the one hand, it modifies the definition of inherently beneficial use, where now electric vehicle charging infrastructure are considered inherently beneficial. It's noteworthy. These electrical vehicle charging equipment or apparatuses are now considered accessory structures and are therefore permitted in all zones in New Jersey. The law has been structured in such a way that it promotes really administrative review so that permit applications that come in for the installation of electrical vehicle charging stations can be done administratively and wouldn't come to the board because they're trying to sort of short circuit that so the infrastructure gets installed. There's a prescription for the number of spaces based on the nature of uses and certain ratios that are associated with the number of parking stalls. And I think it's noteworthy that these charging stations are not required for single-family and two-family homes, and retail uses with fewer than 25 parking spaces are exempt. So in reviewing the ordinance that the board has before it, again, it follows the state model ordinance very closely. It does not include the entire ordinance, which I guess remains a question of ours, why certain sections are included and not in our other towns that have implemented a similar type of ordinance. They've just adopted really the whole model ordinance and have made some tweaks. And most of the ordinance can't be modified at all. And it says that it has to be adopted verbatim, and that towns have no flexibility. There's one section of the model ordinance entitled Reasonable Conditions where towns do have some say in terms of modifying the regulations. And those reasonable conditions pertain to installation, a sight line, setbacks, location. It could also pertain to signage and other health and safety aspects. So we have seen some towns just adopt the model ordinance verbatim, and we've seen some, do these tweaks of reasonable conditions. So it's something for, I guess, the board to consider. And really, the board's task tonight is to conduct a master plan consistency review of this ordinance to determine the extent to which that it's not inconsistent with the borough's master plan, and then forward any recommendations to the council. So that's the board's job tonight. And as Marina pointed out, in the resolution, there is some support from our master plan from the 2020 reexamination report that this board adopted. It talks about the promotion of EV charging spaces, and certainly this would be implementing now the law of the land. So I would certainly say at a minimum, it's not inconsistent. I know that's a double negative, but that's how the law is written. So it would be my opinion, again, that the ordinance proposed is not inconsistent with the borough's master plan, but the board may want to recommend, again, making any modifications to the ordinance, which would, again, either include the entire model ordinance or make certain additional conditions. One example would be signage associated with EV charging stations could be limited to a maximum of 1 square foot. That's just one example. Another example would be having certain provisions for either the enforcement, penalties, violations, fines, et cetera. Some other towns have done that. And again, some towns have made modifications, others haven't. It could be tweaked in the future, certainly. So those are our comments, if the board has any questions.
Okay. Go around the room. We'll start with Mr. Pratt.
Yeah, can you just point out where the exemption for under 25 spaces is? Just because I don't remember seeing that.
Well, it's in the model ordinance, and I believe it is also in the one being proposed. Bear with me while I flip through. And I should mention that any provision that's not in our ordinance, but is still part of the state statute, still applies. So I think that's worth noting. So I'm on page 4, item C, speaks to something of that effect with regard to exemptions from electric vehicle charging station requirements.
But I don't know.
That in I'm not sure I'm seeing that.
Page 4 of the proposed ordinance, item C.
Actually, don't.
Yeah, I could-
Under
I can give you more.
approvals and permits? Are you looking at the resolution or just the actual ordinance?
Oh, I'm looking at the resolution, I'm sorry.
The resolution is just a summary of
Okay.
what's proposed in the ordinance, but I'm just trying to find it in the actual
Okay.
22-2.
I'm not sure I have the actual ordinance.
The discussion is D about percentages.
It's under, D, or no, C, oh, no, yep, you're right, D, 8. A retailer that provides 25 or fewer off-street parking spaces where the developer or owner of a single-family home shall not be required to provide or install EV SE.
Okay, does the fact that it's retail apply only to specifically retail? I mean, I guess what falls under retail?
General merchandise sold to the public. I mean, there are definitions. I don't know if our ordinance defines it, but that is, I think that's specifically the language in the state ordinance,
Yeah.
so we have to mirror what
Yeah,
is
I mean,
required.
right, I mean, would that apply to restaurants? Would that apply to, or would that strictly be merchandise
I,
types of stores?
I think it would not include restaurants if, there are two separate definitions for retail and restaurant, like most towns have, or most
Right.
planning entities have. So to your point, it would likely apply, but again, this is the state's regulations or statutes, so we don't really have flexibility in that regard.
Because I guess, my overall reaction to this is, electric charging stations being desirable to people is one thing, but, obviously, one of the biggest problems we have in town is, I can't think of a application for a commercial entity that we've looked at in the last couple of years that had enough parking spaces. Nobody meets code for parking spaces. And this ordinance says, effectively, if you have 10 parking spaces and you put an EV parking space, you really end up with 7 normal parking spaces at that point, because you can delete one required space because of it. So now you're down to, 10, you're down to 9, but one of them is an electrical station that you can't park in unless it's electric. So for the rest of the vehicles, we've gone from 10 to 7, the way this ordinance is written. I just want to make sure, is that accurate? And if it is accurate, it's also true that we don't have any choice but to comply with it. Is that?
I think you're correct on all of your assumptions, and it is what it is to some degree. I will say, though, that in River Edge, especially along Kindercomack Road in the south end of town, which are mostly developed, if we're talking about a change in tenancy, I'm not sure that would trigger the need to then have electrical vehicle charging stations. I think this applies more for, a site plan change where, the site's being modified or completely redeveloped. And in that case, you would look to, the extent to which these would be required.
Also, I don't think it would apply to applications that, I'm sorry. I was looking at the 51 to 75, but it would apply to applications that are below 50 parking
Right.
spaces. Okay.
Right. And everything rounds up
Yeah.
in favor of more electric. And again, given the nature of the businesses here, I'm going to imagine that most of the people who are going to businesses here in electric cars are from the neighboring, either from the town or neighboring towns. People aren't traveling 300 miles to get here to go to Sanducci's as much as I like Sanducci's. But, so, to a large degree, they're probably being serviced at home as far as getting electrical chargers. And again, we end up losing what is a pretty rare resource in this town, which is adequate parking. It sounds like we can't do anything about it, which is, I think, frustrating. But I guess if nothing else, I get to vent my spleen a little.
So also, Tom, I would like for you to comment this, and Marina too. In my reading of the ordinance, which we are obligated to pass to some degree, it also states, if I read it correctly, that while an electric car is in a charging parking space, they have to be charging, and that they cannot remain in the parking space once they cease to charge. That it's not really a parking space, but a charging space. And that they have to vacate the charging space after a certain period of time, which must be designed by ordinance. So the council's going to have to consider that. And so that it's open for someone an electric car that needs to be charged.
Right.
So
Correct.
it actually just becomes a temporary space
Right.
that probably is going to be more often than not empty. Is that correct?
It's a fair comment.
In the model ordinance, it does state that EVSE parking shall be reserved for parking and charging of electric vehicles only.
And I think there's a paragraph or there's a sentence which says, if you're not charging, you can't remain in space.
So, which makes sense, but, and your point is valid, and, it brings into question a question of compliance, then you have to trust people or you have to enforce it.
Well, I think
And-
later on in the ordinance, it says, the model ordinance says that the police department has to enforce it. And if I'm not mistaken, this is what I wanted to ask you too. It seemed to suggest that our police department has to enforce it both in the public spaces and in the private spaces. Because it did seem to suggest that in the private spaces, well, let me rephrase that. If we have a townhouse and it has a space and someone has, parked there, then our police department and they're called to that property, then they're called to enforce that. Though that was a little bit unclear to me because I'm not a lawyer and, I was unsure.
Yeah, I'm curious to know, like, do you know when it stopped charging? When you have a meter on the street, you know that it expired, but it could have expired 5 minutes ago, so that'd be very difficult for the police department, especially in a townhouse or, in the back of the diner or something, for them to know when that expired and, should someone really be at fault for
Yeah, I
being
don't know.
done? And their chicken's done, like they're not done with their meal that becomes a problem for our police department and
Well, that's my
in enforcement.
concern.
Yeah.
So in the text of the model ordinance, which is also in the proposed ordinance, under F3, subsection C, it's specifically titled public parking, and that's where it discusses municipalities' police department. So EVSC parking spaces shall be monitored by the municipality's police department and enforced in the same manner as any other parking, but that's specifically under the public parking.
So we don't have to go, our police can't be called by a landlord of, say, a condominium or an apartment complex to enforce someone who is violating the rules. I would think we are called if someone's in a handicap spot, right, for the apartment parking. So I would assume that our police could be called for the EV.
So the signage requirements in the ordinance require that information about hours of operations and time limits, or if time limits or tow-away provisions are enforced by the municipality or owner designee. So if garden apartments have a EVSC charging station, they need to post a sign saying their tow company's going to come and enforce it. Or if the public if there's a public parking space, it needs to say River Edge Police Department.
Okay, and would we be recommending that as a zoning board? Would the council be making that decision when it returns to them? What's your opinion?
Whether the signage is going to be for the police department or I think that would be a council decision.
Okay.
The question, section G, right after where you just started, it discusses private parking, and I'm not sure I understand the definition of private parking, whether that's residential or if that's multifamily. But it basically says that for private parking, the use of EVSE will be monitored by the property owner or designee. It sounds like it's private enforcement if private parking means like a condominium.
Yeah, so then whatever, any EVSE space that's on a private property would be the private property's
So they
responsibility.
set the rules and they enforce the rules, is basically the way that reads.
To monitor or enforce? I don't have the statute in front of me, so.
The way it's written, it says that the use will be
On the top.
monitored by the property owner, and the property owner has set forth explicit rules regarding the use. It actually doesn't say who enforces it.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. It doesn't
That's
talk about
up-
enforcement.
This section can be adjusted by the borough. This is one of the sections that can be changed. So if there's a recommendation that this board wants to make, we can make that to the council, and they can decide if they want to adopt it or not.
Just to take a step back to section D with the public parking, it does say an electric vehicle in such a space when it is not connected to an EVSE. So that would lead me to say even if it's not charging anymore, as long as you're connected, you're good. So even if you pull up with a full charge, plug that thing in, you can stay there. So I would imagine for our police department, it would really just be a matter of, is it on a public street? And we installed it, the town. And is there a wire connected to the car? I guess that's what this is saying.
Or do they look at it like a parking meter, and if it says charged?
But it says, so it reads, "It shall be a violation of the section to park or stand a non-electric vehicle in such a space, or to park an electric vehicle in such a space when it is not connected to an EVSE."
Yeah, that's what I read.
So it doesn't say charging,
Right.
it just says connected. So if the wire is connected to the car,
So I wonder what kind of, these actual units that are going to be giving the energy, I'm sure they probably monitor themselves. I'm guessing there's probably some way of connecting it to the police. I mean, everything talks with everything these days, right? I mean, it's,
That's true.
I would assume also there's a feedback, once a car is fully charged.
right.
Will these stances be then like a parking meter, simply saying, changing from green to red?
Right.
but it still says connected to, not charging.
But I thought I read somewhere else in the ordinance, and I had read it for when it came to us for the first, but I knew it was coming here. I read it more detailed in preparation of this meeting. And I thought it said that we, as the zoning board, need to recommend, and the council needs to consider a maximum time in the spot. Didn't
Yeah,
it say that?
because this, you could just plug in and leave it there all day and not actually charge.
I
I
thought
mean,
there was
unless
somewhere-
there's something else in the ordinance that I haven't seen.
Yeah,
but-
well, the interesting thing is, if you look up above in 3A, it says publicly accessible EVSE shall be reserved for parking and charging electric vehicles only.
But it says shall be connected
No,
to
I
an
know,
EVSE.
it doesn't
And then
carry.
B says reasonable time limits must be placed by the owner of the EV on the number of hours that electric vehicle may charge. So that seemed to suggest to me that the council, that the zoning board, well, land use board, and the council need to consider what would be the maximum time you can remain in that spot. That's why I was saying to Mr. Cray's point about, this reducing the number of spots. If this, and, Councilman Canigo and I need some advice from you, the residents. How long do you think would be a reasonable amount of time before we would, say, you gotta move that spot?
I guess we have to know how long it takes for the average electric car to charge. I mean, if it takes,
Well, I
an
know
hour.
that has to do with the degree of, what is it, 220 and
Yeah.
440?
Yes.
But whatever it is,
I
I personally don't know if it takes an hour or 8 hours to charge, so that
Right.
would make a difference in my decision as to how to proceed with a time limit. If it takes a half hour to charge, then maybe.
I know it doesn't that. I was reading about it
Charging.
earlier today.
Yeah.
And like on the very, very high end, it could be 40 minutes. Like on the good end,
Does it say
I would
time?
think it's probably longer, but do you really need to let someone sit there to take their car from empty to full too?
Right, exactly.
I mean,
Like, is a
I would
half
think
hour
an hour-
charge enough to get you 20 miles
Right.
further?
Do
No, I-
something
Like that,
480s?
right.
but I would think you'd have to put an hour or 2 hours or something, because then they could just, monopolize that space all day
No, absolutely,
and
absolutely.
take away the benefit to the other
Right.
electric
agree.
vehicle cars on the road. That's the whole point of this, I guess,
Under
right?
the public parking section in the proposed ordinance, the last, which is 3D, the last sentence says, "Any vehicle parked in such a space shall make the appropriate payment for the space and observe the time limit for the underlying parking area if applicable." So if the borough already has time limits for parking, like 2-hour limits, that could apply to the EVSE spots as well. So regardless of whether it's done charging, they're gonna have to move their car just like anyone else,
Oh,
if there's a time limit, like for meters. Something like that.
but does the non-elected on this board have an idea of, what would be reasonable for spots that we don't currently have time limits on?
I would think a 2-hour limit should get you, again, I don't think you need to go from empty to full.
Yeah,
I think that's likely a reasonable time to get a good amount of charge.
Sure.
I mean, I don't own one of these cars, but I would imagine that would be
And
Should be
and
sufficient.
if
I
you're
don't have one
installing,
either, but I was thinking 2 hours as well.
if you're installing the 240 volt charging systems, 2 hours should be enough.
Where are these going? We don't know, right?
It's so new that it's a little bit confusing. I mean, for instance, the way I read it, and I've had conversations with a few people, would we be installing this, say, if we had meter parking, like, like Ridgewood has? Would we be doing meter parking on the curb? Or would we be limiting this to like the borough parking lot and the parking lot the transit parking lot, commuter parking lot? But then if we're doing it in the commuter parking lot, when someone plugs in, they're not gonna be back for 4 to 6 hours, maybe 12.
Yep.
So how does that work?
I think there would be a limited amount of spaces where you could put it, because you really couldn't put it in front of, River Edge Pizza Kitchen, because it would kill their business.
Yeah.
Like, we need to allow that in and out for those places
Right.
on Kinderkamack, and it would have to be places like that.
We have the Grant parking lot, it's in Grant area, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
The Grant down there. And again, that's an employee, we set it up as kind of an employee parking lot so that the Kinderkamack spots wouldn't be taken by employees. But then, the whole question is what would be reasonable before they have to move?
I suspect that what is reasonable today is going to be adjusted even 2 years from now.
Yep.
Because, so we shouldn't get too hung up on it, because we're going to have to tweak it anyway. As more people get EVs and the demand grows, then either you're going to have to create more spaces, charging spaces, or you're going to have to reduce the time that people can spend on these spaces.
Well, that's a good point.
So
you're
right now, there's
suggesting-
not much of a demand, so I don't think we have to strain too much to find the perfect time.
That's a
I
good
mean,
point.
2 hours certainly sounds reasonable, but if 80% of the population has EVs, maybe 2 hours is way too long, and people start fighting, saying, why are you sitting there? You're 90% charged, let me in. So I think as we have more use of electric vehicles, there's going to be a higher demand, and we're either going to need more spaces or have more time restriction, or both. But, I expect probably in a couple of years, whatever we decide now is going to have to be tweaked and adjusted later on.
I would agree
That's
with
an
that.
excellent point.
And the battery technology too, to your point, ultimately it's going to catch up to where
True.
the batteries are going to hold a charge long enough. You don't really need to plug in each time you stop or.
Yeah, but at the same time, if there's this proliferation of electric vehicles, residential charging stations are going to be all over town. Everybody's going to have one in the garage. Are we solving a problem like the handicap problem, where you go through most parking lots and there's empty handicap spaces that aren't being used, right? Because again, these will only be charging spaces, they're not going to be parking spaces. And, when you start adding up all of the exemptions on parking for handicap, and now you put the EV in, and park there, but you're going to credit the required parking spaces, and we're going to get down to fewer and fewer actual parking spots. So I think, the ability to manage, again, the loss of a pretty rare resource around here has got to be, it's important. We can't.
It's only a rare resource because more people have fuel-powered cars than electric cars.
No. I mean, I'm talking about, if you look at pretty much any application we've looked at for a commercial business in town in the last 3 years, none of them have adequate parking. We're always creating variances for parking because we don't have enough parking places. And now we're going to lose a percentage of those because they're going to be charging stations only, and then we're going to the business owner another space because he put in a charging space. So now we're going to lose effectively 3 spaces for, every time someone puts one of these in. So, I mean, that's a lot considering we have very few of them.
It is.
Is there any provision in here for restricting the amount of these spaces?
I didn't read it.
There's no cap.
So, well, not say a cap, but let's just, use the diner. they decide to take their whole parking lot and turn it into EV parking. Right? And then it causes problems and they have to park on just a drastic example. But to that point, if we're losing 2 to 3 spots when they go in, can we or do we need to have some sort of limit? If you have 25 spots, you can only put in 1. If you have 50 spots, you can, to prevent taking too many of these spots and creating more.
So when I read it, I didn't see
Because
that.
I could see someone, I don't think I saw anything there.
I thought there was a sentence in it that said, doing more was permitted, period.
Right. There are minimum requirements, but there are no maximum requirements. And,
So,
yeah.
I guess the reason I'm asking is, like we've said, there are buildings that have issues with parking. So now if a building owner looks at this as an opportunity to make money, and I don't know if these stations actually make money for these people or not, but if they see this as, I can make more money off of this, and now I don't need as many parking spaces per variance, then we could have even more of a problem. Does that make sense?
Well, if a private owner, let's say the diner, comes to that conclusion, right? And they say, I can make more money if I have all my spaces be charging stations. They also run the risk that people who don't have electric vehicles are not going to be able to park in their lot. So
Correct.
they might lose business that way. It might, and I don't know, I'm not sure what the ordinance says, if anything, about whether a non-electric vehicle can park in a charging station
No, it
space.
No.
No, they
So
can't.
that's absolutely not.
prohibited.
So,
Absolutely.
I mean, I think a private business would necessarily want to have spaces for both. And
You
they
have,
probably-
you have some shared use buildings, and I could see potentially someone taking abuse of it. And I wouldn't want to give, variance relief to someone that puts in too many of them and then doesn't have enough for
Yeah,
business.
or the other danger, and what I was actually thinking about, is that in the application process, where typically, we might push them hard to say, no, you need to work 3 or 4 more spaces in here. They go up to electric charging stations and they're bulletproof now. Because this ordinance overrides, what we would have required. And that's where I see the real danger, is that you end up, being able to game the system when you're making the application, for your initial variances.
So in response to Mr. Gibbons first, if it's an application solely for the installation of EVSE or make-ready spaces, it has to be considered a permitted accessory use, and the borough can't make any additional requirements. And the borough can't require a variance for those spaces. So if a diner wanted to put in a bunch of these EVSE, that's the only thing in their application. It has to be approved administratively.
Okay.
With respect to Mr. Cray's point, if a development of an already built, if as part of a development application, they want to install the EVSE spaces, site plan approval is required. And so we can make sure that, yes, we're putting in the EVSE spaces, but you also need to meet the RSIS or whatever other borough parking requirement there is.
Okay.
Is this limited to just certain developments, mixed-use residential, or is it across the board, commercial and?
It's commercial and residential 5 units or more,
Okay,
which would include mixed use.
okay.
Okay.
So a single-family home couldn't put one of these in for commercial use?
This is where it gets tricky, and this is where towns can, come up with certain regulations in terms of location. So right now, these things, the way the state law works is that they default to accessory uses. Then you look at, okay, what are our accessory use requirements or accessory structure requirements as they pertain to single-family homes, retail, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. So the way we have it structured now, they're not permitted in the front yard, let's say, and there are minimum setbacks of 4 feet from side and rear lot lines. So, so I guess in that sense, it would sort of prohibit, a freestanding thing in the front yard, at least for the first 30 feet at a minimum. I think most people will install them in their garages if they can fit them, and then I guess run the plugs, however that's going to work.
But is there any prohibition about using it commercially?
I think it would
It would be,
Go
it
back
would be
to
a sticky
whatever-
situation.
whatever underlying zoning there is in residential areas are at-home occupations permitted, are commercial occupations permitted at a home.
I think there would be a distinction because the ones that people use at home, there's no, you're not going to be inserting your credit card or, putting your phone up to it.
Why couldn't you
It'll
put
just-
one in?
I guess you could, charge cash or whatever. So in theory, could people abuse that? I guess we would. I don't think it would be permitted, to answer your question. I wouldn't view it as
No,
being permitted.
I just wouldn't want to see someone using their driveway as,
Yeah, stop here and, the
Yeah,
newest
it's a gas
app, come
station.
charge your thing.
and then having a sign or, just,
Yeah.
again, I don't know if anyone would think of it, but, think the worst.
It's a
I
new
mean, can-
technology, it's emerging.
Can we prohibit that? Would we even want to prohibit that? I don't,
Yeah, I think you could specify that. It can't hurt to specify.
But that would go to your zoning restrictions, like Marina said, is if your house is in a residential zone, you can't just set up a commercial enterprise in your driveway, whatever it is. So
right,
that
but
would go-
an architect works out of his house. Just
So,
as an
yeah.
example, so I don't know what our ordinance says, so.
I think that's where we
know
would
what the
have to
answer is.
look. We'd have to look
Yeah.
at the zoning and see if that's permitted, that kind of
Marina,
operation.
can you review that for us?
Sure. Also, going back to what Tom said, we have a provision in the code that says if something's not expressly permitted, it's prohibited. That might help us in.
Yeah, again, just, I know there's architects from work from home, there's some real estate agents that work from home, does that kind of blend into something like that? I mean, I know it's not a storefront, but I just wouldn't want someone setting up, having a large 4-car driveway and pulling cars in there all day.
I don't think working from home is the same as a commercial enterprise from home. I think there's some distinction in the law. I can't point to it off the top of my head, but I think there's a clear distinction there, professional services versus retail, and sales of goods and chattel and so forth, so.
Yeah, I'm sure. I just want to make sure that we're
Just to,
not allowing something we don't want to allow.
just to get clarification, yeah, it's commercial and it's residential with 5 or more units. There's an exemption for retail with 25 or fewer spaces, but that definition for retail is kind of open, right?
It's I'm going to look to see if the state has a definition. I mean, there are definitions in a variety of sources. The state doesn't have it defined in its model ordinance. I don't think we have it defined in our ordinance, but there are resources that, to your point, versus a personal service, dry cleaning. Then, okay, you have a strip mall with a restaurant, retail.
Right.
What do you do then? I think you'd probably default to the retail, and, I think the tie goes to the runner in certain cases. But again, the diner, that's not retail, or other uses like that. So
Right.
I
They're
guess,
usually defined earlier, and like, it may not be within the ordinance itself, but it may be in a preamble that those definitions are set forth. I haven't looked at the whole thing, but.
this is the state one. I don't see it in the state one, but that's not to say that it's not located in some other statute. And, there are planning resources that, one looks at if it's not available elsewhere. But, yeah, I think that's something that may have gotten overlooked, not by the town, but by the state.
Right, and to your point, yeah, if you have a strip mall, how do you, and someone's coming in for their particular business, but there's 4 other businesses there and there's X amount of parking spots, how does that get addressed?
Wouldn't that get addressed through the property owner? Even though there's 4 different businesses, it would be the property owner who we would hold accountable for the amount of spaces.
Right, but if it's a mixed use
Well,
type of thing, where it's commercial, yeah, if there's a
apartments
restaurant and
upstairs,
there's
you're
retail,
saying?
right? Let's say you have a restaurant, you have retail, you have a diner, you have a delicatessen. We have to have some definition of what's retail and what's commercial to even start figuring out how to apply that.
So, I mean, we have a discussion later on about ordinance topics. Generally, I think our ordinance does lack certain definitions, so I'll leave it at that. But again, I think it goes back to, if we're looking at a change in tenancy situation where a pizzeria is coming in where a convenience store was, but the site's already developed,
Right.
I don't know if we'd be, it's more when the site's being redeveloped. We had the proposal for the Dunkin' Donuts and whatever's going next to it.
Right.
That may be an opportunity where, I forget how many spaces they have there, but they may even be exempt. But then again, they're not retail, so.
Right.
So here we go. But I think it's primarily in the cases of new development and not necessarily for changes in tenancy,
Got it.
at least my understanding at this point.
And so to that point, let's just use Dunkin' Donuts because they're a future application, but could they just come in, apply for their site plan approval, get approved, and then go into the building department and ask for their EV stations?
Yeah, I mean, the point of the state's program is to have these approved administratively and not come to boards at all. So, but again, I don't want to pick on the dial, let's pick on, Sandusky.
No, yeah,
They wanna
I'm not trying to
do their
pick on
whole
them,
lot with
but
EV stations, they would come in for a permit application and we would have to approve it, assuming they meet the bulk requirements and other things. There are, certain safeguards, but those are the things that we could expand upon. We don't have to. And again, as these things evolve, maybe that's something we look at, as they start popping up and we go, that doesn't look good, or maybe we should tweak that. It's new, everyone, is trying to figure it out throughout the country, really.
yeah.
So let's try to pull this all together maybe and with an eye toward coming up with a resolution with recommendations.
So I can start with my initial proposed recommendations to the ordinance. As stated before, F subsection 4 has a typo, so I'll include that in our resolution. That should be corrected. The ordinance should reference what section of the zoning code is being changed, or if it's going to be a whole new section. I think it would be appropriate to make it a whole new section. I'll figure out the number of what it should be, but I don't think it should be interspersed throughout the code. It'll just be a new section of our zoning code that says electric vehicle supply service equipment. Also, one of my initial recommendations was that F subsection 6 should also include subsection B and C from the model ordinance. And those sections, section F6B states that this fee may be amended by a resolution adopted by the governing body. I think that would be good to have the governing body be able to change this if needed. I think that might have just been neglected or left out by mistake. And then subsection C, private EVSE. Nothing in this ordinance shall be deemed to preclude a private owner / designee of an EVSE from collecting a fee for the use of the EVSE in accordance with applicable state and federal regulations. Fees shall be available on the EVSE or posted at an adjacent, posted at or adjacent to the EVSE parking space. That may have also been mistakenly left out, but I think it might be.
I think that's one.
That will help promote. Oh, that one was included.
That's 6A.
Oh, it's marked as 6A, okay.
Please do this rush.
Okay, so then the town left, the borough ordinance left out 6A from the model ordinance, which states, for publicly accessible municipal EVSE, in addition to any parking fees, the fee to use parking spaces within the municipality identified as EVSE shall be like a fee for each hour that the electric vehicle is connected. So it seems like the town left that out. They don't want to charge an extra fee, but that's something that the board can consider as a recommendation.
Mr. Chairman, just because I didn't want to let this go, I did have a conversation with Mr. Merman today, who asked me to make a few recommendations on his behalf. So just for the board's consideration. So the first one would be that there's a requirement for landowners that they're responsible for the maintenance and safety of such facilities, which may be understood, but that was his thought. He also thought there maybe should be some location requirements. I think there was a comment about not having these necessarily right by the front door and hogging those convenient spaces, that maybe they're located somewhere else so people have, quick access in and out. He thought that with regard to public spaces, that they not be installed in the right-of-way for liability and other reasons, so that they wouldn't be installed along the street, for instance. He thought that having signage requirements also made sense, at least in terms of a minimum square footage. He wanted the spaces to not displace ADA spaces. He thought that having some regulations for single-family homes might also make sense in terms of the quantities and, again, not having them in the front yard, that sort of thing. And that there also be a uniform review process in the way of sort of a checklist that every application for these things has to meet certain requirements in terms of, they're shown on a plan, they have certain technical specifications or whatever it may be. So when they're submitted, they can be reviewed and processed efficiently. And finally, that they not be permitted in site triangles per our site distance requirements. So for the board to consider.
Well, good recommendation. That's actually good. I think it's a good point about the right of way, because depending on the make of the electric vehicle, if you have to go to the traffic side of the car to plug in, that could create a safety issue. So that's a good point.
Okay, so that would be F4. We could add an additional subsection to say that owners of private EVSE shall provide maintenance and safety for the EVSE space. Is that what Mr. Merman had suggested?
That's what he conveyed to me. More, yeah, that they're responsible for the upkeep and,
Okay.
I guess, safety also.
And that they wouldn't be able to be located in the right-of-way pursuant to our bulk requirements.
In the case of a private facility,
Oh,
but a public
okay.
facility, I think, not placed on Kindercomac, pick a street in town.
Okay.
That they remain out of the right of way for a number of reasons.
Okay.
Is there a requirement for municipal stations in here?
Well,
I was confused when I read this about that question.
so there is a new requirement that towns have to address the provision of EV charging stations in their master plan.
Yeah.
So you have to at least start thinking about them. There's no minimum requirement, but you're supposed to make a statement in your master plan as to how you're going to be providing them, let's say. And I think we touched on it very generally in the reexamination report, but there's no, plan per se, but I think it's something that'll evolve, or the town will start doing. Some towns are already developing fleets of electric vehicle, police cars, DPW, whatever, so it'll come, and then the town may just opt to put them where necessary, if at all.
Right, but nothing in this requires action municipally.
Not in my reading, Maureen, is that, I don't think there's anything that requires the town install a certain
Not that
number of
I'm aware of,
spaces.
no.
Right. Even if it were to install a new lot, I don't think the town is required.
There is an obligation for the town to update the master plan to incorporate
Right.
EVSE, but that's the extent of it so far.
So it's more like a best practice, planning practice.
Right, that we're thinking about it, and when we do implement them, we'll put them at the library or Borough Hall, whatever.
Okay, and so we're going to include F6B from the model ordinance allowing private owners to collect fees. Fix the typo in F4, add a subsection in F4 regarding the obligation of private owners to maintain the spaces and provide safety and not install in the right-of-way. And we also discussed possibly in F3, F3A, changing the language from publicly accessible EVSE shall be reserved for parking and/or charging electric vehicles. Then that'll cover the public spaces that are only allowing charging. And then we discussed making a change to F3D for the public parking spaces, making it a 2-hour time limit.
Just a question, you said and/or publicly accessible EVSE shall be reserved for parking and/or charging?
Yeah.
Wouldn't we want to leave it and charging? Because then they actually, then that, would that not read, you could park in that spot and not charge?
Yep, correct.
So that's for publicly accessible. Okay.
Right. I would want to force the person to be charging, wouldn't we?
Then would we change the language to park in order to charge?
Or just leave it? I mean, publicly accessible EVSE shall be reserved for parking and charging electric vehicles only.
So my concern is privately owned EVSE that is accessible to the public, you're allowed to just park there. You don't have to be charging.
Right,
But you
that's how
have to
the
be
law is
connected.
designed.
So if it's, so publicly, but
If a
privately owned but public?
privately owned spaces, but accessible to the public. So if you had it at the diner, you could just park there with your electric car. You don't necessarily have to charge it.
So it's a
But the
private-
owner could put a restriction on that and
The
tell
owner,
you?
yep, the owner can put a restriction on it.
Yeah, that's what, I think G says, that the owner of a private EVSE may set forth explicit rules regarding the use of their EVSE by others.
Okay, so we're allowing them to allow them to do it, basically.
But doesn't your concern get addressed? I know we touched on this before, but it says the electric vehicles shall be connected to the EVSE. So
Right, but still, I don't think we want to let the person just plug in and leave it there for 12 hours.
I hear what you're saying.
So we could leave A as just saying and, but then modify D for specifically the public parking spaces to be limited to 2 hours. If it's a private parking space,
And be
it's the
charging?
owner's
The owners.
Yeah, that makes sense.
discretion. Okay.
Anyone else? Further input?
Did we include all the recommendations from Dick?
I think we're,
Um,
Tom, did we include?
We can
we can
touch
discuss,
on those if need be,
but
but
I'll make sure to.
I'll run, one had to do with the maintenance and safety, from landowners, that the borough consider having location requirements, no installation in right-of-ways, that the borough will look at signage requirements to ensure that EV charging spaces won't displace ADA spaces, that the borough consider requirements for single-family dwellings, that there be a uniform review process with a checklist, and finally, that these facilities won't be located in a site triangle or impact site distance.
Also, did we decide that the language was clear enough that the police are not responsible for private?
I think it was in there somewhere.
It was okay. Because I want to make sure
Because
that
I
was
was
clear.
concerned about that. I thought.
So the,
I think the private parking talks to, I think it's 3B.
It's up to the homeowner.
I think private use of the EVSE shall be monitored by the property owner or designee. The owner of a private EVSE may set forth explicit rules regarding the use of their EVSE by others. Those rules must be reasonable and considered on a case-by-case basis. So
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
it's the public parking section above that where it speaks to the municipality police department.
yeah, and then, so F5 in signs, Mr. Merman had suggested limiting the size of the signs.
Well, that was one such example, and that's
Oh.
probably the minimum tweak you would make. I've seen some towns, have a maximum of 1 square foot. I mean, it's generally the area, I guess, that you want to regulate. I've also seen towns regulate the size of the actual facilities. If you've been to the Garden State Plaza, some of the units are quite large. They're all different brands. Again, it's evolving, but I've seen limitations of 4 feet in height, let's
I
say.
thought that was in the ordinance, that it couldn't be more than 4 feet high.
Maybe, I may have
I
missed
think
that.
the hose, had something to do with, I just read that.
See, the hose.
The hose could only be 4 feet high, I believe.
No, I thought the sign was 4 feet high and the hose could only be, I thought I saw
So,
36
yeah,
inches or
it
something
says
like that.
outlets and connector devices shall be no less than 36 inches and no higher than 48 inches from the ground or pavement surface where mounted, and shall contain a cord management system.
So I guess that doesn't limit the actual height. Because the cord could be here and the sign could be,
Or of the unit itself, of the
unit.
charging unit.
The units at Paramus Park are tall.
They're big.
and they have advertisements on them too, a lot of them, which we wouldn't want to.
I would very much like this board to prohibit
Off-site advertisement.
website or marketing or.
The sign would be limited to, I mean, I don't know how to say, but what is needed to alert that it is EV and any charges that would apply.
Yeah, but no third-party advertising and no first-party
And no
exploitation.
no electronic
Flash.
signing.
Yeah, let's add that. Last thing we want is,
How's that enforced?
well, I don't know if we can enforce it can we enforce it on the private? We can certainly enforce it on the
If-
public.
You can if you have the regulation.
Right, the
If
sun.
you don't have the
So
regulation.
if it privately owned that has public parking, we can enforce that, right?
If you put in the ordinance, it says no flashing signs on EVSE equipment, it applies to everyone.
That would be good. What do you guys think?
Or no electric
You
sign.
might even be able to refer simply to our sign ordinance. I don't know if that's sufficient. It doesn't tackle all the issues, but it may eliminate some things.
So we can say no third-party advertising and no, and then in the borough code, it does prohibit flashing
Flashing,
signs, so we can say,
I-
and
you know.
compliance with underlying sign requirements.
right. I mean, you could get into lighting. I mean, you could go really deep into this. So maybe you start there and then, see what needs to be done. I tend to believe that most property owners will be reasonable. Not always the case, obviously, but,
So just to be clear, so if a private establishment, let's say River Edge Diner, has an advertisement in the newspaper and they want to say, we have charging stations, can they do that? Or you're saying,
We're saying.
No, the sign at the space.
At the space.
The physical sign when you pull in can't have, go to McDonald's, go to
oh, I
buy
see,
Nike
that kind
shoes.
of advertising.
But we would also want to limit it that today's our special. Not the River Edge Diner, but just anybody. There should be no advertisement at all.
Right, the unit itself, right, has screens on it, which could be flashing.
Because
all
gas
sorts of-
stations in the
right.
south and in the Midwest do that. You pull up and, they play commercials.
It could say whatever the brand of
Yeah.
the thing, but that's okay. And I'll add that under the sign requirements, under F5.
And we should also say something about sound that it should not, because we don't want them playing music or beeping because the last thing we want to do is, for residents nearby, to hear, that it's beeping because even on private residency, I don't know how you'd say that though.
Shouldn't make any noise.
Shouldn't make any noise, period.
Yeah, it's something like that.
Yeah, I'll try and be creative.
No auditory signaling.
We have some ordinances that talk about decibels, right? So you can probably figure out something with no more than a certain number of decibels.
Unless it's just a noise ordinance.
Or refer to our noise ordinance, although I think we have to revisit that
Yeah,
ordinance
that,
as well.
that would allow too much sound because the noise ordinances, I see, like, for instance, we have the crossing, the flashers, and it used to beep quite loudly. And the residents who lived at Clarendon Court were saying, 11, 12 o'clock at night, we're hearing this, especially during the summertime. So we had to go and change it. But since we're here discussing it, I think we should just simply say there should be no auditory signaling or playing of music or anything else coming from the device.
I can't see why you would need to have it function. I can't say why you would need it.
I'm thinking advertising.
No, I know why you'd want it, but I don't see why you would need it.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
To signal that the car is charged, you're probably not standing next to the car when it's done charging anyway. So I don't know that any auditory
Well,
would be required for the use of the machine.
Say you have an apartment complex and you have underground parking and you put in an EV station And then the manufacturer says, I can give you that if anyone plugs in, after 6 hours, it will start beeping. And then there may be a home next door, which we do have right now, and they're hearing this beeping. And I would just rather avoid that before it begins.
I'm totally on your side. I just don't see how it would be needed. Would it be a nice thing for the owner of that EV to have? Yes. Is it needed?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
I'm on your side. I don't think it should make any noise.
Okay, good.
So I'll just summarize one more time so I don't miss anything.
Okay.
So we're going to include F6B from the model ordinance allowing private owners to collect fees, fix the ordinance typo in F4, add subsection to F4 regarding obligations of private owners to maintain and provide safety for the stalls, no installation of the stalls in the right-of-way or impacting site triangle or site distance. F3D will include a 2-hour time limit for public parking. F5 will include a subsection regarding no third-party advertising or sounds in excess of just operating the machine, like if it's a screen, sometimes those have sounds, and comply with borough signage and lighting requirements and the noise ordinance, because we could, if that changes in the future, then it'll still apply.
Do we need the maintenance? Mr. Murphy's comment about maintenance?
I did include that. That'll be in part of the subsection for F4. Did that cover all my notes too? And I will also include a reference to a new subsection of the zoning code.
Okay. Okay, anyone further input, discussion? Okay, that said, I would entertain a motion for a resolution, motion to recommend adoption of the ordinance, as we've discussed with our proposed revisions.
And, okay, so the motion has to incorporate our proposed revisions and our decision, the board's decision of whether the ordinance is not inconsistent with the master plan.
Okay.
Okay. And the mayor and councilman can participate in this vote.
We need a resolution.
We just need a motion.
Motion from-
Yep.
Motion from the board? To-
Sure. You got it.
Okay, so we'll move at, Mr. Pfeffer
Mr.
makes the
Pfeffer,
motion
right.
as stated by Mr. Caslin.
I didn't want to repeat all that.
What she said?
Yeah, exactly. Ditto.
Okay, and we need a second.
I think Mr. Gibbons.
Second.
Oh, Mr. Gibbons.
I'll second.
All right, Mr. Mayor,
Yes,
Mr. Caslin,
Yes.
Ms. Boland,
Yes.
Mr. Pfeffer,
Yes.
Mr. Cray,
Yes.
Councilman Kenigo,
Yes.
Mr. Gibbons,
Yes.
Mr. Esposito.
Yes.
All right, the motion passes.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Okay.
so in the little break, I know that some of us are having Wi-Fi issues, and so I'm going to ask the borough clerk to email all members of the board and give them the Wi-Fi passwords so that, electronic devices can be used.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
All right, the next item on the agenda this evening is the memorialization of Paul I. Perkins and Belkis A. Almanzar Perkins, 311 Kinderkmack Road, Block 1004, Lot 26. Although it's on the agenda this evening, I'm going to table action on this resolution for this evening. We need to review a couple other things in the resolution, so for purposes of this evening, we will not be taking any action on that, but we will be taking action on that at a later meeting, at the next
The
meeting,
next meeting is
March 23rd.
March 23rd.
Okay.
And I will circulate a revised resolution, but Mr. Barrett, the applicant's attorney, did provide me with a missing date of the survey and a few other revisions that I found to be acceptable. So I'll incorporate those and recirculate it to the board, and it'll also be posted on the borough website.
Okay, that's it for memorializations this evening. We move directly into some topics that we have been previously discussing. I think in our last work session, we left off conversation regarding lot coverage. So I know that I'm going to ask Marina to, when she gets
Okay.
a chance, to update the board on some research that she's conducted on the lot coverage discussion, and kind of further our thoughts on how we approach possibly making some changes on those requirements. So,
Okay, thank you. So at a previous meeting, we discussed having different improved lot coverage percentages based on lot area. I discussed it with some of the other attorneys. That's a common thing in some towns to have sort of a stepped improved lot coverage percentage. Just based on our discussions previously, I thought of possible solution for that would apply to single-family properties. And first, we could have one tier for lots with lot area of less than or equal to 7,500 square feet. The improved lot percentage could be up to 40%. Then a lot area between 7,000 or greater than 7,500 square feet, but less than or equal to 10,000 square feet, an improved lot coverage percentage of 37.5%. And then if you have a lot area of greater than 10,000 square feet, an improved lot percentage of 35%. Now, I'm not sure if we want to also adjust the lot coverage number. That seems to usually be a compliant number, or only a slight variance for those ones. But the improved lot coverage is what causes the problems. So if we give the smaller lots a greater opportunity to improve, but still require the larger lots to comply with the existing code. Just a thought, but open to any suggestions.
Sounds reasonable to me.
So that was giving a little extra, did I write this down right? So for the 75 to 10, that's giving them an extra 2.5?
Yes. But if that's something that,
I just want to clarify. And then it's the 10K and over that we're keeping steady.
Keeping
So the ones below that are getting a break. Okay.
I think they're reasonable. And I wouldn't say to change the lot coverage, because that's where we have the issue, where everybody maxes out on that and there's not enough for the improved lot coverage. So,
And that, even though we don't regulate FAR, it would effectively allow for bulkier homes, which I think would be problematic at this point.
Yeah, we're already seeing bigger houses on a pretty regular basis.
The average developer builder maxes out the house first, for the return, then you have the driveway, and then there's whatever's left. And on a monthly basis, we get, I would say, at least 2 or 3 applications where that's being done, maxing out the house and driveway with nothing left in the rear yard. And, but this should help a number of those parcels, at least give them a little wiggle room. But we still may want to consider having some reservation for amenities in the rear yard, that they have to, pick a percentage, 2.5%, 5%, whatever, for a patio, for a shed, what have you.
You're saying an extra allowance for that?
Not an extra, but within, let's say, the 40%, a certain amount has to be reserved for a rear yard amenity. It's just one thought. I mean, there may be another
I
mechanism.
think that's a great idea, personally.
have you seen that in other towns?
It hasn't been an issue quite like it is here for some reason, but I think it also pertains to the low coverage requirement that we have. Some towns have extra amounts to play with, so it's less of an issue. And when there's a good balance between, we'll call it the building coverage and the impervious, they tend to work each other out. But I think because we are a little low, that's why it's been an issue. So hopefully this will help May not resolve all problems, we'll still have applications before the board, but it seems to be a step in the right direction.
And my other thought was that by granting even these slight increases for some of the smaller lots, it could help builders say, okay, well, I just want to conform and I don't want to have to go before the board, but I'll still be able to get what I want. I'll just make it a little bit smaller.
I think just one note of caution is that there's the danger of creep, right? Because, you know, when it's 35%, we give them 40. 40, give them 43. So it's just, you know, something we're gonna have to be cognizant of because people will still ask for more. It's gonna happen.
But if we can say that they have to reserve 3% for backyard
That'll help.
coverage, whether it be a shed or a patio or a deck,
Whatever, yeah.
or whatever it might be,
Right.
then that makes it easier to say no, because you already have it.
And that would be on a build or a new construction kind of thing, the
Well, the
3%?
problem with that is they're playing games with that too. There's a property I walked by, my wife and I, when the weather was better, walked pretty regularly, and we're back to it now, or we're trying to be. And it was a 3-wall rebuild, but then the third wall fell down. I mean, the fourth wall fell down. So it was a complete rebuild.
Right, but,
So,
yeah, but a rebuild like that, not a homeowner turning a cape into a colonial.
no, but if I think if they're changing the foundation, that would be considered.
Well, there's our zoning code and there's the building code. So our zoning code says that once you remove 50% or more of the dwelling, then you lose, let's say, all grandfathered rights. So, you know, your non-conforming setback would have to be rectified. The coverage is still the coverage. But I think the building code, you know, you could have one brick of the foundation and it's still an alteration. So you have those two sorts of things that developers take advantage of.
So how can we fix that? Well, what would you recommend to this body?
What is just so I understand, the
Our
issue?
goal is to get 2% or 3% or 4% of reserve in the backyard. Because that's where I think that's where we're running into problems.
And absolutely, yeah, we're developers coming in and doing that sort
Because
of.
people should have a deck. I think that's reasonable, right?
They want decks. I mean, more people are spending time in their backyards.
And I think that's good.
Right. And I think, you know, we've talked about it, we're comparatively low to other towns, so I think this will help, and it'll give people, you know, an ability to have, you know, something that works.
So how do we put that 2 or 3% or 4%?
Does the board have an opinion? I mean, if, you know, what's 1% of 7,500 is 75 square feet, so times 3, that gives somebody, let's say if the requirement's 3%, that gives someone 225 square feet. Not huge, but it's.
Well, we're really putting it in as a reserve to prevent the builders from overexpanding.
Right, a reserve. So what a person with a 7,500 square foot lot would have reserved is about 225 square feet for a patio and a shed, essentially. So that could be a, 10 by 20 patio with a little bit left over, not much. It'll be tough to squeak a pool in most cases, but again, things will have to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis.
So basically, whatever the percentage is, we would say, for example, for 7,500 square feet, we would say they're allowed to build up to 40%, of which X percent must be allocated or reserved.
Right, there'll be an asterisk essentially in the bulk table. I mean, we
that's
can
what I was
work out the
thinking, too.
mechanism, but something to that effect. And then the question would be, what's the right percentage? And that's,
Right.
So,
I
I mean,
gave the one example of.
Effectively, what we'd really be saying is you have 37%.
Yeah.
Right,
For the dwelling and driveway.
right.
Right.
But then people always ask for that extra 3%, so we're kind of saying, we already gave it to you.
Right, exactly.
So is that an ordinance change that's done by the council? Is a change done by this body? How quickly can we get it done?
So
I'm sorry.
Well, you go first, Tom, it's fine.
Well, my thought is we have a number of ordinance items that we're going through. To me, this seems to be an important one and one that we could tackle relatively easily. And it would, any ordinance change that this body contemplates, there would be a recommendation that goes to the council for consideration. They would introduce an ordinance that comes back here for master plan consistency review like we did tonight, and then would go back for adoption. The coverage thing, again, we're getting into building season, might help homeowners out this year. It may also stop overdevelopment in town this year. But again, we have a lot going on, so it either gets done sooner than later, or it can also go with any other ordinance modifications like the porches or definitions or whatever else. So that's up to the board.
And just one question, what triggers the need to keep the 3%?
Yeah, it's unclear to me too.
It would just be an ordinance requirement. So when an application gets submitted for review, it first goes to the building department. As a zoning, acting zoning officer, I would review it and then make sure that the dwelling and driveway and walkways don't exceed whatever, that agreed upon number is, the 37.5 or, 32%, whatever it is.
So if they're going for an addition, if they're going for a total redo or whatever, so that is something that would trigger the need for 3%.
I mean, I
I
think,
just want to know what constitutes the need to save the 3, that's all.
For the existing.
Just to clarify.
oh, I see what you're saying, like under what circumstances,
Yeah.
whether it's a new build or more than 50%.
Right, so I want to add a second level to my, like, when does that,
Right.
when does it kick in, is I guess just a clarification of what,
It could be for all applications, or it could be for new development and, or you're adding X amount of square feet might be one way to look at it too.
Yeah, we could, the ordinance could say that this 3% reservation only applies to new construction, and we could, the definition of new construction could be revisited within the zoning ordinance, or it could be changed to conform to the building code just for consistency's purposes, and then,
Construction bill wouldn't really address the problem, because the problem is people who are expanding their footprint and then expand to the limits and then later want to come back, or builders who do this and then later the new homeowners come back and say, we want a deck. So that's not just a new construction, especially in light of this, a couple of bricks are left standing, so it's not a new construction.
Right.
if you're adding 50%, I mean, that was the definition you used before. If you're adding 50% to the floor.
If you remove 50% of not the footprint, but of the volume essentially, so that would be, you take off the second floor and maybe a little more, then that would be, from a zoning standpoint, starting from scratch with regard to setback.
Yeah, I wouldn't want someone leaving a brick and getting away with it.
Right, so so in this case, to your point, at what point do you require it? Either you do it for all, or I think what you're getting to is you don't want to impact the average resident trying to do something, but.
Yeah, I mean, someone adding, a bedroom over their garage.
Well, you wouldn't be, so in that case, you wouldn't be expanding the footprint of the house, so
Well, where does that definition lie? So, because you could add 50% to your house and not change the footprint. You can knock the whole house down and not change the footprint.
right, so.
So I
that
can knock
would-
down a ranch, build 2 stories on top of it.
Right.
It
It would still be a factor of the coverage percentages. It would still, you'd have the lot coverage being maxed out at 25%, and then the rest would be for the impervious or improved lot coverage.
To cover all bases.
Yeah, no, I hear you. If you have a suggestion, I mean, we're working through this now. Now would be the time.
Yeah. Would we be able to, as part of lot coverage, I think as the building,
Right.
require a minimum, say 10 by 20 deck / patio? And then that would cut into the 25% building coverage. And it would be able to be part, tackled at the time of the building.
The,
the 3% reservation would apply to the lot coverage instead of to the improved.
Well, not necessarily a 3%, but we could say minimum 10 by 20. Maybe they want a bigger deck, but it would still be it would be lot coverage. And then it would help later on when they come back they can do other stuff with the 40,
access.
30,
I hear what you're saying. I'm trying to think through. We do break, so decks and patios are two different, patios typically don't constitute lot coverage.
But only in this case because we're trying to not force a deck if they only
Right.
want a patio. But we still want that area saved, like a deck is lot coverage.
Right.
So maybe we call, we can define anything, right? We could call a patio
Say that it's building coverage.
building coverage because it would be a minimum, not, they may come in later and add more patio, that'd be fine, but
For
a
the purposes
minimum
of the
of,
reservation. We could do that, so take it from the lot coverage.
take it from the lot coverage.
Does
so
that effectively then reduce the 25%? Like if you're saying you have a maximum 25%, but you have to reserve 200 square feet, doesn't that by default kind of pull back the 25%?
It does, but it saves problems.
I hear what you're saying, yeah. So it's another option.
So it would sort of limit the the lot coverage then, where people think they have 25%.
Could it be possible that, Marina, you and Tom put your heads together and come up with a memo with
Alternative.
these alternatives that could then go to this body, and on a regular business night, we would then have read the memo, and we could have a short debate on which direction we want to go on as soon as possible.
Sure. We can do that for sure. But my other comment, going back to how do we get this done, any changes to the zoning requirements either need notice to everyone who is affected or need to be related to the master plan. I'm not sure in the last reexamination if it talked about lot coverage.
It may have, as in terms of reviewing the topic. Frankly, I don't recall. So what Marina's saying, in lieu of notifying the whole town, if we did let's call it like a 2-page master plan reexamination amendment, that would circumvent that and probably save a lot of time and effort and money.
Then,
I think so. You'll agree?
And would that be done by our board or the mayor and council?
That's a planning board document, so it would be done by.
So then us approving it would be approving it.
yep, and that document would want to incorporate all types of, we could incorporate all zoning changes we want to make. So then we can get things done all at once instead of having to keep doing this over and over, many like reexaminations. So if we have other issues that we want to address, we could include that in the reexamination. So then we can actually get these ordinances introduced and passed.
Well, I like that, but the only problem is we still have a very long list, and I don't want us to be doing this in November.
No, yeah, so definitely I agree. We have to choose what are the priority items. I know that the improved lot coverage was a big item, pools, and then the porticos, and that was an issue a lot the previous year. We didn't see too many in 2021, but in 2020, everyone was putting a portico and needed a front yard setback. I don't know if that's something that we wanted to incorporate as well, but Tom and I could include those in the memo as well.
So, Mayor, I guess to address your issue, the master plan, quickie could be done now to address all items, and then you can implement the various ordinance requirements at the borough's leisure. So if there's,
So it's still going to require an ordinance change.
oh yeah, any of these modifications would require an ordinance.
Well, I think that's good. And if that can expedite the process.
Because that document can be more generic. These are the goals that need to be addressed and changed, and then the ordinances actually affect that goal.
That'd be great. And you guys would then send a memo to Tom Sarlo describing how we need to make those ordinance changes so that,
Right, it would be effectively the board's recommendations that, we recommend this part of the ordinance be changed to say this, and send it off.
I like that. With the porticos, I forget, did we say we wanted to make it so they didn't have to come before us?
I think my notes.
That was my recollection.
Right, specifically porches, we would give up to, I think, a 6-foot encroachment into the front yard setback. they would still have to meet the coverage requirements, but you could have a porch, if the front yard setback requirement is 30 feet, they could extend as far as 24 feet into the front yard. It could only be one story, unenclosed, but they'd have to meet the 25% lot coverage requirement. I think that's.
And I guess that would include just having a covering over your stairs.
Not just over the stairs, something that one.
No,
could
but to include that as well. So if you
Right,
just
that would be
want,
part of the porch.
I guess it's technically a porch.
Once it's incorporated, yeah, I think so.
I love porches, so.
I do too. I think it adds to curb appeal, improves the overall value of the town as well as the home. And I don't think the public should have to come to us every time they want to just cover their steps. But I don't know how everybody else feels.
No, I agree with that, but I have a question. And this, I hope people don't think this is a troublemaker question, but it could happen, okay? We're operating on the assumption that people want decks and they want patios and they want sheds. And I agree that the vast majority of people do want that. But suppose someone wants to waive that, okay? And they want to say, well, I'll give up that 2 or 3% that you've allocated for a patio because I just want a bigger house. So do we want, and it's just a question, do we want to even allow that?
To play devil's advocate, that person's not staying in that house forever. So in 10 years, they're going to sell it. And the next guy might want it.
Okay.
And then we're going to have to give a variance. I think every builder in town would say, no, I don't really want it.
Right.
I think that's what we're trying to protect ourselves against, not you adding onto your property.
Yeah.
It's the people that don't have a vested interest in our town. They build and they move on. That's my opinion.
That makes sense. Yep.
Yeah.
That'll be another thing that we incorporate in the recommendations.
But I suppose someone could come to us for a variance.
But there will be cases.
Right?
You have the issues that you have, you have virtually every lot in town is developed. So every time somebody does an addition or wants to extend it, there will be applications that come to the board.
Right.
And like we've taught you to review them on a case-by-case basis and that, they go through the justifications.
So, someone could do it with permission, right? So if they wanted to go to 40% and not put in a deck, they would just have to come to us and get approval. And if it's justified, then they could get it. I just look at it as the long term, these houses are going to keep getting sold. It's not my house forever. It's going to be somebody else's.
Right. That makes sense.
So I think Tom and I will prepare initially documents for the master plan reexamination that cover all of the topics. So then we can address those. And then we'll also prepare a memo about the improved lot coverage, possible changes. That will come after. We can do it at the same time, but that can't be introduced until the master plan reexamination is effective.
Okay. Great.
Okay.
Do we need to talk about pools versus whether they're considered permanent coverages or not? A lot.
I'll refer to my notes and correct me if I'm wrong. I think where we left off was that both above ground and in-ground pools would count toward improved lot coverage, but we would exempt, we'll call them seasonal pools that are, erected for a certain time of year, that would not be counted as coverage, but they would still have to adhere to the applicable building code requirements.
That was my recollection too. I'm just wondering if it has to go to the master plan and whether it needs to go to the council for ordinance adjustment.
It would be a similar type modification.
That could also be incorporated in the reexamination, and then an ordinance would also have to be adopted. These multiple zoning ordinance changes could be in this, zoning changes could be in one ordinance.
Well, that's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah.
That's why I'm asking the
Yep,
question.
that
I'm not
could-
trying to monopolize this, but I want to make sure that when we bring it to the
Yep.
council, we're doing it as one
Yep,
ordinance.
we could do that.
Other topics were signage. So
So, not to jump, so signage, that's kind of a heavy topic. I don't have any specific examples. This board, we talked about it maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and there was authorization to revise the sign ordinance. There was a subcommittee put in place which didn't gain much traction. So that's almost a wholesale, what was contemplated at that time was a wholesale review of the sign ordinance. That's more than a modification here or there, so that you may want to tackle as a separate thing.
Yeah.
But I think it still probably needs some level of modernization.
Yes, I think that was coming up more. I think we had a lot of applications in the southern end of town with commercial applications. That seems to have sort of waned a little bit in the last couple of years. So, but we should, while we have the opportunity, we should look at that. But I agree with what you said. We also have on the list here garages for residential properties, and this is kind of an interesting note that we have here, given the topic we just discussed earlier with charging for electric vehicles and how we, whether we need to address that at all. And the idea of, do we, are we going to have, double wide driveways? How are we going to, address that even with, electric vehicles? You're going to need, I would think, a wider driveway to bring 2 vehicles in to charge both closer to the charging point and within the garage. So,
So many other towns in Bergen County, suburban towns do have a minimum garage requirement. Some may just simply say that, 1 bay is required, 1 10 by 20 garage space is required. Some will have a threshold that, a house above 3,000, I'm just making it up, 3,000 square feet requires a minimum 2-car garage. And some towns do it that way. Currently, we do not require any garage at all, and so some recent examples are, I'm going to convert my garage into an office, so now I have no garage. You do have older houses in town that were never, 100 years ago, were never developed with a garage, and, then, if they're doing an addition, they may not be impacted, but again, we're talking about new builds or somebody substantially enlarging the footprint of the house. Now they have a 3,500 square foot house, and either no garage or, 1 little tiny thing that was there when the ranch was built and is barely functional. That's the issue. Whether or not the board wants to think about it, that's up to you guys.
Thoughts, comments? Something we need to look at?
I don't think so, honestly. I think if anything, double driveway is something that we should be looking at, allowing people to expand their driveways because they have single driveways. I think a lot of these houses in town have these small, tiny garages that aren't really car garages anymore. They're like storage sheds, really. So to make people put those in or require it, I don't really see that as a big problem in town right now, but the driveways, I think, is something that we really should be looking at for a variety of reasons. It would help out congestion on the streets, traffic patterns, accidents that happen, and the DPW in clearing the snow and the leaves and so forth. So that's
But now we're back to reserving for lot coverage, aren't we?
Well, I think it could also just allow someone to have that extra space. I mean, what is the width of a regular driveway and a double wide? Do we know what that?
So I'll take you down the rabbit hole here. So the borough allows a maximum driveway width of 22 feet. So that's what people are allowed to do, and they're allowed to develop right now up to 35% coverage. So those are the limiting factors with a minimum 2-foot setback. Anyway, RSIS, New Jersey's residential site improvement standards require a minimum parking stall size of 9 by 18, which, if you have a side-by-side, that's a minimum of 18 feet is a good parameter. Obviously, the larger you have it, the more luxurious it is, the more space you have. Some even have it a little tighter than that, but 18 is kind of a good ballpark for a side-by-side situation. And, the question becomes, do you want to merely permit it or require it? Personally, I tend to think allowing it gives people then the choice. Maybe they only have 1 car or 2 cars, and I think the flip side is that if, let's say, every house has a 22-foot wide driveway, that's a lot of green space you're losing. And also, if you have those curb cuts, you have less on-street parking, which I understand that may be the thing you're trying to prevent in the first place, but just to give both perspectives.
I wouldn't say necessarily requiring it, but 9 by 18 by my math is 162 square feet, which, I mean, I guess it would be longer than that because the driveway is probably longer than
About
18.
30 feet, right? Most houses are built to the 30-foot setback, so
270 square feet.
give or take. And again, some are wider, some are 20, some are 22 wide.
I mean, to help, I don't know about requiring it. I mean, maybe with a new build, maybe you would want to require it. I wouldn't say necessarily for someone just adding onto their house because they might not need it. But having some sort of allowance, I think would make sense to keep the cars off the street, to allow people to park next to each other. You know, like I live in one, you know, half the time my wife's in the street, half the time I'm on the driveway. You know, parking behind each other is difficult with different work situations.
The only thing,
You know, allowing it, I think, might be.
It came up 8 years ago when I first got on the council. A resident called me up and said, you weren't the zoning officer then, but the zoning officer was reviewing the zoning rules. And the driveway was going to expand towards the center, and it would then, the driveway would then segment the bay window that was on the house. And so, and the way the zoning officer at that time read it is that was not permissible because the driveway had to be in front of the garage and could not be in front of the living space of the house. So that ordinance was declined, and the resident came to me, and I was just a councilman at that point, but I still went to the zoning officer, and I went to the mayor at that time and the business administrator, and they said, no, that's correct. But it brings up an issue. If we do double wide, how far from the property line will it be, and how far will we allow it to extend across the frontage of the house? And then does that end up making us look like Yonkers or other urban areas, Union City, where you have these double, you know, or some of these new developments where you have these two-car garages or two-car driveways, and essentially it then makes it all the way to the steps, and so it gives more of an urban feel. I'm just throwing that out because that's what happened 8 years ago.
But I guess if you have the coverage, it doesn't stop you from doing it, though.
Right. Say, well,
Well, right now, 22 feet is where it stops.
Right, the only limitations are the coverage, again, 35%, and the maximum width of 22 feet. To my understanding, there's no placement requirement, and if you look at the way most houses are situated, the garage is, let's say, only 5 feet from the property line, so you theoretically can only go inward toward the, that's the only place you can go, is toward the center of the lot, because again, you have a 2-foot minimum setback, so, you know, toward the front door in most cases is the only way you can go.
But now if we're saying it should be 18 feet wide, was that what you were saying?
I'm saying that's sort of like a minimum standard.
So a double car would be 36?
No.
No, 18 is with two cars next to each other.
So it's about
9 foot for one car.
right, so you're like
So
560.
are we currently permitting 18?
We're permitting up to 22 is the maximum.
Then why do we need to do something?
I think it's allowing people that are at their coverage or over their coverage to add the second.
That then goes back
Encourage
to the
people to get-
coverage of you'd have to have some allowance, and then you can do whatever you want. I'm just saying that's the balancing act we're playing with right here. So the question would be, how do you tie that then? So we're talking about raising the lot coverage up to 40% for lots 7,500 square feet and less. How do you then create a provision for, or accommodating extra driveway?
Right, and it's about 270 square feet.
You're adding another 5%-ish, depending on the size of the property.
3 to
You're allowing those to
5%.
essentially
Right, 3 to
potentially go up to 45-ish.
45, I was going to say.
I mean, applicants do have the opportunity to submit an application. If you do it as of right, you'll probably see a lot of people doing it, and I think there's a loss of green space that could happen. I'm not saying people shouldn't have them, it's a double-edged sword, that's all I'm saying.
I mean, maybe if you limit, if you are maxed out, that you can only go 18.
Well,
Or you can
I-
only add a certain
yeah.
amount of square footage or I don't know. Something
I mean,
to
the way I
limit
see
the
it
amount of
play,
loss.
just the way I see it play out here, you know, although they may not want to come to the board, you know, I just bought a house in town, it's developed the way it is. You know, we've got 2 teenagers and 2 cars, and our garage doesn't fit a car, and we'd like to expand our driveway up to 18 feet wide. We'll mitigate it with some, you know, infiltration, you know, stormwater drainage management, you know, and we'll get cars off the street, you know, and that's a public benefit. You know, what do you think about our application? I mean, that is one way things could play out, and therefore you deal with it on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, but here's my concern. The overall value of the town is dependent upon curb appeal.
Right.
And if we start turning our front yards into parking lots, it diminishes the overall value of the town.
I agree, yeah.
But it's
That's my
not,
concern.
but it's still not allowing something new. So if you have the lot coverage, you can do exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah. And I don't know if we need to correct that or not.
So I mean, we're talking about correcting the lot coverage anyway, so if people want to increase their driveway space, they can use this extra percentage that we might be allotting to do so. And that really addresses what we're talking about here. It just addresses that problem as well. You choose deck or driveway.
Yeah, but then they come back and they say, I need a deck. And then the next,
I don't mind the case-by-case basis. I really don't, because then you have an opportunity to address other things, you know, like we did with that resolution a few weeks ago, where there was concrete on the side of the house, and we said, take out that concrete, put flagstones. You'll still be able to walk without walking in mud, but now you're alleviating some of the flooding issues that we're facing in town. So having that homeowner come before the board allows us to address issues that we wouldn't otherwise be able to address. So I'm not terribly against that. I mean, it may mean a lot more work for us and for our professionals, but, you know, it probably ends up in a better situation for the town overall.
I think if we limit it to certain trade-offs, you know, so it's not open-ended, because if it's open-ended, then we're back where we started from, right? But if we have specific trade-offs, you can have a wider driveway or you can have a bigger deck. You can't have both, right? So that extra 2 or 3% that we were talking about would be only for specific things, not just anything. 'Cause then
Shared driveway or deck.
Yeah, right.
Marina, would that
I was just thinking
would
that
that be legal?
there is a possibility, I don't know if I think that Tom and I could address it more in a memo, but there are some ordinances that incorporate bonus options. So if you do one thing, then you get a little bit more of this, or often it's incorporated with density, like if you install a certain amount of parking, then you can have more units, something like that. But it could be applied with respect to improved lot coverage as well. I think the details would definitely have to be, maybe Tom and I could work through them first before discussing with everyone, but I think that's a possibility.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay. All right. Well, it's 9:20, so I think rather than trying to dive into anything further tonight, I think we've covered a lot of ground. So we can certainly keep the list going, and maybe, you know, if there are other topics we want to add to it, for the next work session, which we'll schedule probably at this point sometime near June. I think, you know, we're going to try to do it quarterly. It just so happened we were able to kind of condense it before the agenda items rolled out, so this was.
I just don't want it to take too long because, you know, then we're into another council, and if we could get to the master plan by August so that the council could consider the ordinances in September, you know,
How much
or
time?
work backwards, because, you know.
I mean, that's way more time than I
Yeah, that's
thought.
more than I was expecting as well.
Only because he said that the next workshop session would be in, you just said,
Thought maybe May, because we're March
May.
9th.
so, I mean, that would be at the outer limits. To be very honest with you, I'd love for us to be able to have the master plan done and for us to be working on the ordinance in July.
I think it's reasonable, sorry, Mr. Chair.
No, and the reason I say May is because I believe the April agenda is already fairly packed.
Yeah, I think so
So,
too.
and I want to make sure you have enough time to do
I appreciate
what
it.
you need to do, and, you know, certainly based on the mayor's suggesting, you know, what your estimated time to turn around, you know,
I would aim for that May work session. We'll
Yeah, I
have a
think
memo and a draft report, and
Yeah.
and maybe circulate it before the May session so we can look at it, be ready to discuss it when we schedule it.
So can we adopt a master plan amendment, I guess is what it called,
it's,
in May? And then could we move to an ordinance in June? Is this something that is,
if you like it as presented, if you don't want, you know, if, you know, I'll submit a draft, let's say. If you review it and like it, you could adopt it that night. If you say, oh, we might want to, you know, modify a few things, or if there's an ordinance topic we didn't get to and you want to add, then it would be amended and could be done, you know, 2 weeks later, or whatever the case may be. So you'd have the opportunity, yes, to adopt it that night.
And if there was a rush, we could always have a special meeting that was noticed as well.
that'd be great.
Or we can, you know, if it's a small enough modification, we'll just make it an agenda item
That'd be
for
good
a
too.
regular meeting.
Yeah, because the sooner we can do it, the better.
Yeah, I think we could do
Are you
it.
guys okay with that? I don't want to kind of push the agenda, but
Push it.
I just realized that, I mean, we started talking about this 2 years ago. Could be the teacher in me that I just want to set deadlines and get things done.
We seem to be mostly in agreement.
Yeah.
So it would really just be wording.
We don't need to open the public hearing, right?
There's no members
No
of the
members
public
anyway?
here.
All right. Making sure. Okay, that said, appreciate everybody's input this evening. I'll look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Mr. Gibbons,
Second.
thank you, Mr. Esposito. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed, any abstained? We're adjourned.
There you go. It's great seeing everyone in person tonight.
It's about time, right? Let's do it again next year.
Without masks, huh?
Take these off.